I don't play many scary games. It's not that I don't enjoy them, or I'm just so scared. There's just not many that appeal to me, with perhaps the recent exceptions over the last 5 years being Alien Isolation, the most recent Resident Evil games, Alan Wake Remastered, and Bugsnax. So then, it's very rare that I ever play horror games prior to the current generation of gaming, even though there were some cracking good games when I was a child. Dino Crisis, the original Resident Evil games, Silent Hill, and Alone in the Dark, A New Nightmare. Speaking of Alone in the Dark, I had always been curious. I'd played some of A New Nightmare and even a fair chunk of the 2008 reboot, but I had never actually looked into the franchise's roots with the original Alone in the Dark, made in the very early 90s. And so I recently sat down and played the first game in the trilogy, and would like to share with you my thoughts and experiences with this retrospective, and hopefully this will be the first of many retrospectives to come. A full spoiler warning is in effect, but chances are most of you aren't going to play this anyway, so with all that said and done, sit back, relax, and enjoy the spoops. The game is set in the year 1924. Upon starting, you are tasked in choosing between one of the two main protagonists to play as, Emily Hartwood or Edward Carnby. There's no huge difference between who you play as, except each have different introductions to their backstory on how they were notified on the death of a man named Jeremy Hartwood, who hung himself weeks prior. When choosing Edward, he'll explain he is a private detective and has been asked to uncover a piano for an antique dealer, which is found in the loft of Jeremy's mansion, named Decetto. Choosing Emily, she'll reveal that Jeremy was her uncle, and with his mansion on the verge of being sold, she takes it upon herself to head to his mansion and uncover why he might have killed himself, and believes the key to this information is also hidden within the same piano. For my playthrough, I decided to play as Edward Carnby, purely based on the fact that his name is a staple in the franchise, even if Emily would probably have been the right choice here. I did check though, and there's literally no other story differences between the two. It's purely just for aesthetics. You arrive at the sudden frog there. You arrive at the Decetto estate, where you're being watched as you walk up to the house. You let yourself in, only for the door to lock behind you. You make your way to the very top, to the loft where the piano is, which is where you start your investigations. As you progress back down through the house to find a way out, you find yourself attacked by various monsters, such as spiders and zombies. Through various texts you find, you also learn that below the house are a series of caves that lead to a ritual site, where a pirate named Pregs has been sacrificing people to try and extend his life by taking over their bodies. If you find the letter Jeremy leaves behind in the piano, he reveals that he killed himself to avoid being sacrificed. It's also explained at some point that Pregs was shot and killed during the American Civil War period, and his spirit ended up imbued in a tree hidden within the caverns, and is the reason why the house is filled with supernatural forces. After fumbling around alone in the dark, you eventually find your way to this tree, where you use your lantern to burn it, thus forever banishing the spirit of Pregs. With the house free from supernatural forces, you are free to leave, where your driver picks you up. Oh, also, your driver is a zombie for some reason. And that's Alone in the Dark story, and if I'm being honest, yeah, video game stories in the 1990s were weird, man. To the game's credit, there's a lot of world building, whether it's from the numerous books you find, to various documents, or even the newspaper clippings that came as extra on the GOG version of the game. The problem is that a lot of what you find is just a wall of text. Fortunately, these are read out to you by voice actors who show the emotion that is implied in those words. Though, I'll admit, sometimes they convey the emotions you don't expect. Take Jeremy's letter. He seems so nonchalant about killing himself.
They will find my body, but will not have my soul. I can imagine the master's fury and the terror in the hearts of his slaves. I hear their footsteps. Some may understand what I have done. May God forgive me. Farewell. Jeremy Hartwood.
I guess then maybe he was just crazy? I'll be honest too, the story lost me, and it wasn't until making this video that it started to make any semblance of sense. It also doesn't necessarily help to be going through gameplay, doing your thing, and then I need to spend the next 5 minutes either reading or listening to a voice actor tell me things. It's a game that tells but doesn't show, which doesn't make for great entertainment. However, this can be forgiven due to the limitations of those early 90s games, since there was only so much the technology and the game company's budget could do back then. What these books and documents do provide, however, is hints as to how to progress and what to do, even if they're not always obvious. Which brings us to the next section. It's very clear to me now that video games such as Resident Evil owe its success to Alone in the Dark, as it borrows various survival horror elements from it, most notably the stationary camera in a section of a room as your character progresses through the mansion. You start up in the loft and make your way downwards through the mansion, where once you pass the 3rd floor, you're essentially free to explore rooms in any order you wish, as long as you have the required items to progress into them. Along the way, you end up fighting various monsters, such as zombies, spiders, this thing, and a pirate, which, if I'm being honest, I still don't know the proper way to defeat this bastard. He just kept blocking most of my attacks. Seriously, what am I doing wrong? Anyway, to fight off these monsters, you'll need to find various weapons, and these can vary from guns, daggers, swords, and a statue. Some enemies require specific items for you to kill them, and you can usually find the information on how to fight them through the various books or notes you find, which is why it's important to pay attention to them, even if it does feel like a school history lesson. There are some aspects of resource management. You only have a limited number of bullets or health items to use, but often I found myself using my sword, which has unlimited uses anyway to progress. If anything, the only thing I needed to worry about was my health, but then if I made a mistake and took damage, usually I could just go back to a previous save file, so it often took a lot of the danger away. That's not to say there weren't some atmospheric moments that worked quite well though. A couple of times you'll encounter enemies crashing through windows or sneaking around the corner, but those moments were so few and far between, and I would have loved for the game to play more on those cliché horror tropes, which I guess in the 1990s wouldn't have been cliché, but would have just been the standard. To find the items you need to progress, you'll need to search various places for them, such as on shelves and in chests, and you do this by selecting the ability to do so in your inventory screen. No, I don't mean for example you stand in front of a door, choose open and then it opens, but you're essentially selecting the ability to open the door, of which you then do so at the push of a button, since the action button, this being the spacebar on the PC version, can be linked to multiple other actions. I guess they only had like 10 buttons on the keyboard in 1992 then. Speaking of the controls, they're kind of rough. For the first hour of my playtime, my character had this very slow walk about him. I did wonder if he could go any faster, especially in a game about fighting monsters where you'd surely want to run away from them, but for this first hour I couldn't figure it out. It wasn't until I accidentally tapped the top arrow key twice that I found my character could run. Though my god, you really have to be resilient, as sometimes sprinting this way just didn't work a lot of the time. My fingers absolutely ached after constantly trying to double tap to run. Oh, and yes, to move, I used the arrow keys, just like it was commonplace to do so in the 90s. From what I could tell, there's no way to change this, and it's probably why my hand hurt, as my right hand doesn't have the muscle memory using directional keys that my left hand does. However, the only keyboard keys used were the arrow keys, the spacebar, and the enter button, which if I'm being honest was still quite a chore to use. As for combat, it could be quite janky. You prepare your weapon holding the spacebar, and then use the arrow keys to fight directionally. Enemies moved slow enough for you to prepare what you needed to fight them off, and a few slashes or gunshots would kill them pretty easily. Well, Except this dude. Oh, and the rats. For some reason, I couldn't figure out how to kill the damn rats in the basement. There were two problems I often found myself in when progressing from room to room. Getting myself killed instantly, or not immediately knowing the solution to solve a puzzle. For my first point, a lot of the time I would walk into a room, do something, and then end up getting killed because I was either trapped in an animation loop of being hit, or an enemy would just one-shot me. This would be information you clearly could not have known unless you experienced it firsthand. Fortunately, you have the ability to save anytime you like, though you're limited to 6 save slots, so a lot of the time I would save before I tried something, find I instantly die from it, and would be right back to before I tried it. I'm not saying trial and error games are inherently bad. Heck, games like Dark Souls are built around this mechanic. But when some rooms are death traps when you don't know it, and with almost no way to get out of it, how is that even remotely fair? The second problem, which sometimes goes hand in hand with the first, not immediately knowing the solution to solve a puzzle. Take this painting for example. It looks just like a normal painting. However, if you progress down the corridor, it starts throwing axes at you. And chances are you'll be dead before you can even leave the room. It turns out before you progress down the corridor, what you need to do is cover it up. Okay, I guess that makes sense. But wait! There's another painting that shoots arrows at you on the other side of the corridor. How do you get past that one? You shoot arrows back at it. Okay. However, sometimes the solutions are obvious. Here for example there's 3 pairs of dancers, and in order to get the key they are guarding, you need to play the right music. Sometimes the solution is about reading your environment, which games like Portal do superbly well. To me, reading your environment is a more effective puzzle than trying to trudge through numerous books for a few words that give you the solution. We should probably address how the game looks and sounds. Now for a 1992 game, it looks fine. It's mostly just 2D pixel art backgrounds, which for the time are quite impressive and detailed. Weirdly enough, graphically and musically, it gave me classic RuneScape vibes, though RuneScape is a game that wouldn't be made for almost another decade. Despite the game being called Aloneinthedark, the colours used didn't give me that vibe at all. While yes, the browns and greens give it a rather muted look, I didn't really feel like I was in the dark, except for the actual rooms that required the use of the lantern. Some of the soundtrack didn't really feel unnerving enough, but more kooky, which is probably why I felt almost no fear. Have a listen to some of the songs and see what you think. For a lot of the game, I would often be walking around with little to no music. The only times the music actually did play for me was when I encountered a monster or triggered something in the environment. That's not inherently a bad thing. Sometimes walking around with just the creaking sound of your footsteps and the opening of doors can be quite nerve-wracking. But one thing that did confuse me was the odd sting you'd hear. Usually stings are to warn you of something, but most of the time it seemed like the game was just trying to panic me for no reason. When it came to the voice acting, with the exception of Jeremy's weird letter, I honestly don't have many bad things to say.
Upon the promise of a few coins, a child has undertaken to reveal to one a most prodigious phenomenon of a natural order. One admits to being skeptical as to the prodigiousness of the marvel, whatever it may be. Indeed, one suspects it to be little more than an evening stroll to some charming wooden hut situated in the forest hereabouts. One will nonetheless go, for it is always well to submit to such local enthusiasms.
While some of the voice lines are just standard reading, some made the effort into making you feel the emotion of what they wrote, feeling the fear they felt, feeling as crazy as they were when they wrote the book or note. I think if the voice acting was all just static reading, it would have made for a very dull experience. Now, before we finish off this retrospective, Alone in the Dark 1 also came with a bonus game. Included with the GOG version of the first game is a small little demo named Jack in the Dark. It begins with a little girl named Grace Saunders entering a toy shop on Halloween. Or is it Christmas? Anyway, she is then locked inside the store. On the counter, however, is a Jack-in-the-Box, who seems to be making toys come to life and attack you, and so much like the first game, you need to try and find your way out. What's different here, however? There are zero, and I mean zero clues on what to do, so you're generally just left to try stuff. The gameplay is essentially the same as the first game, with the exception that you don't fight the toys, but instead try to find ways to distract them. Fortunately, the building you're in is quite small, so there's only so much to interact with, and some of the actions you're required to do make some sort of sense. Using the drum set to guide the toys in the chest, for example. Grab the makeup box to distract the dolls. Hey, it's Santa! And then to beat the demo, you need to grab a candy stick, which I could not see for the life of me as it was hidden behind the dolls, feed it to Jack, then have him look in a hand mirror where he'll then be scared of his own reflection. That is oddly specific. Upon doing so, Santa is freed! He'll leave Grace a new dress as a present, and then he returns to what I assume is the North Pole. It's only a 10 to 15 minute demo, if you know what you're doing, and the main point of it was to just tease Alone in the Dark 2, not just to showcase some of the mini upgrades that the second game has, but also teases the character of Grace, since you'll soon find she's been kidnapped. But that, my friends, is a tale for another day. Or whenever I get round to bloody finishing it. I don't think the first Alone in the Dark is a bad game. It's a short, creepy, tell don't show experience that kept me busy for roughly 4 hours total. For a game titled Alone in the Dark though, it's by no means scary, at least not in 2021 in my opinion. It has its moments. A couple of times the game made me panic a little, but those moments were mostly due to being swarmed or caught in an animation loop I couldn't break out of. But I think with the idea that I can save my progress literally at any time, a lot of that risk is lost. If I screw up or want to try something again, I could just revert back to a save moments earlier. It's definitely not aged well at all. The controls, despite there being so few of them, often had me muddled, especially when trying to run around the mansion. Like, was I just tapping the buttons wrong to try and run, or... The one thing that I can absolutely appreciate is that it paved the way to some of the best horror franchises in gaming history, and it should always be remembered for what it tried to do, not necessarily what it failed to do, which is be a scary game. Which it's not. Anyway, if you enjoyed this retrospective, be sure to give this video a like, subscribe, and hell, hit that bell if you're eager for the next video. I don't usually ask that. If you're watching this on Halloween, have a spooky day. If you're watching this on any other day, have a not spooky day. Thank you very much for watching. And bye-bye.